Hello and welcome to the Farming Today podcast with me, Charlotte Smith. In this episode, calls for more government action to protect water supplies for farming. But let's start with soil, which many would argue is the very basis of farming. Later this week, I'll be at Groundswell, the Regenerative Agriculture Festival, which is now in its 10th year. Regen Ag puts an emphasis on soil. So this week here on Farming Today, it's all about earth. Let's start by looking at what state the nation's soils are in. Jack Hannam is a soil scientist and Professor of Sustainable Agriculture at Greenwich University.
DEFRA have recently published some indicators of soil health. So we have known sort of historically that some of the soils in England, particularly those under arable agriculture, have been reducing in terms of their carbon content. So it's based on some preliminary data. So around about 65% of soils are capable of reducing kind of runoff. About 60% of soils are in kind of good capacity for sustainable crop production. We know historically there have been declines in soil carbon storage. So only around about 35% of soils in England are at their sort of optimum capacity for doing that.
And I guess here really Northern Ireland could be said to be leading the way a bit because they've got a whole big mapping project going on.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Yeah, I guess it's kind of probably the sort of gold standard, if you like. So I think it's the most densely sampled soil monitoring scheme in Europe at the moment. So they're aiming to sample more or less every field in Northern Ireland for particular soil properties, so nutrients and carbon in particular.
And what makes then a healthy soil?
Is it in a good state to produce food, to support crops? Is it also in a good state to sort of store and sequester carbon? Is it working well in terms of being able to transmit water through it, so we reduce the impact of flooding? Can it cycle nutrients well? So all of these sorts of things that we want soils to do. So if it's in a good state, it's able to do those at a kind of optimum level. But also fundamentally, farmers will know if their soils are in a good or bad state, one by how well those crops can be produced, but also you can see it, you can feel it, it's nice and crumbly. You can also smell it as well, it smells earthy.
There's been a lot of talk over recent years about improving soils, particularly by changing the way people farm, going organic, lots of talk obviously about regenerative agriculture. How long does it take to make a difference?
If we want to try to increase the carbon content in soils, when you change a management practice, so for example, go from till to no-till, it can take up to 2 decades, so 20 years, for that carbon to sort of build back up again and sort of stabilise within that system. Other things can change relatively quickly, so there's a whole plethora of microorganisms that live in soils. And obviously their life cycle is quite short, so they can respond relatively quickly within a few years after you've changed some of the management. So, for example, like implementing things like cover crops, for example. So you're starting to add more food into the system through the sugars that are being produced through the roots of the crops. And those are the things that the microbes will sort of react to and feed off.
Professor Jack Hannam, more on soil all week. Well, here's a question. Could you name the individual alleyways or fields in the area where you live? Well, a series of workshops is taking place across Wales this year to collect hyper-local place names, particularly in rural areas. The names are being added to the Historic Place Names Register to help build a fuller picture of the history of the Welsh landscape. Mary-Claire Carey-Jones has been to one of the workshops to meet Dr James January McCann from the Royal Commission on the Ancient and Historical Monuments of Wales.
What we've got here is an example of the map we used to collect place names in Llanfihangel, Pennant parish. People came in and we sat them down and we said, right, this is your farm here, is it? Okay, what's the name of this field? What's the name of that field? So we've got things like Cai Tan Berllan, Cai Sgubor, Cai Coch, the really minor hyper-local place names that don't appear on maps. So field names, names of streams, names of woods, tracks, and it all gets written down on the map, and then I put it all into our system and it's available for everyone to look at on the internet. The in-depth generational knowledge of a particular locality is really, it's a rural communities thing. People who've lived on the same farm for X generations.
The names here are written in pen, so these are places that you just didn't know what they were before. They were just areas on a map.
If you look at the modern Ordnance Survey map, there's a lot of blank spaces because they don't record the names of the fields and the names of parts of the mountainside generally. So what we're doing is filling in the blanks, partially because, these names need to be recorded anyway, but also because, we have a problem with sort of new English names appearing on the map that have no historical background in the area, but basically the tourists have made them up. And so what we're doing is collecting the actual historical names that the locals have been using for centuries. We've had hundreds of people come in and contribute names.
Right,
Okay, so in 1900 it wasn't there, but there was a house called Penarel there.
And what would that have been, a farmer?
Farm, yeah.
Oh, interesting, okay.
Olivia, you've just been looking at your house on the map here. What do you
Yes.
think about it?
It's nice to see that it wasn't what it is now, and that there was lots of field and lots of greenery there.
My family live in more rural areas, so I wonder whether mine hasn't maybe changed as much as Olivia's has. That house is still there. This farm is still here.
I don't know a huge amount of Welsh, but I am aware, for instance, that if it has a llan at the beginning, llan means parish, so it's the parish or something.
My name's Alice Thorne. I'm Heritage Officer for Archaeology at Banau Brycheiniog National Park. So in this project we're working with the Royal Commission because historic place names are such an important element of our historic environment, and they tell us so much about our landscape and how people have lived and worked here in the past. It's a resource that is at risk, we're at risk of losing it, so by undertaking this work we're hoping to capture this information for posterity.
So, James, what's been the most exciting place name that you've come across with this?
My absolute favourite is the name of a house that doesn't exist anymore on Anglesey, which is Bonk Swamp. It's basically because I like the sound of the name. Bonk is like a small rise in the ground, and it was next to a very damp patch of ground, and so Bonk Swamp.
As a house name, that is unbeatable. That report from Marie-Claire Carey-Jones. We have spent a lot of time talking about heat recently, and I suppose it's logical, even predictable, that leads us on to talking about a shortage of water. On Saturday's programme, we heard from Will Shakeshaft. He's Managing Director at Greens of Soham, which is based in Cambridgeshire, and is a major grower of potatoes and beetroot. Both are water-hungry crops, and in an area which was dry even before the latest heatwave, water is on his mind.
Particularly water abstraction groundwater licences are under threat. We know winter levels are high, so our focus is on how do we construct and build new reservoirs to capture all this water which is surplus in the winter. We could be coming into irrigation bans where we've got river waters coming into nighttime only irrigation, and we know groundwater levels are dropping as well. So it's a big risk to our business.
Well, the National Farmers Union says food security starts with water and is calling on the government to help. NFU Deputy President Paul Tompkins is a dairy farmer in Yorkshire.
Being able to provide water for both livestock and for growing crops and fruits and vegetables, it is becoming an acute issue. Whilst this might have been limited to eastern parts of the country, I'm also talking to farmers in the hills of Lancashire where boreholes and water troughs for their animals are running dry for the first time in memory. And that's what we need to address, is how we're going to continue to provide clean, plentiful water for growing food.
Well, isn't that up to farmers? Because obviously they can save water in the winter by building on-farm reservoirs, and that's what they're going to have to do.
Well, that's the farmer logic, I guess, that we can apply to this. But as we know, that actually turning that into reality is often difficult. Should a farmer have the means to invest in a reservoir on their farm, the planning permission alone can cost up to £50,000 and, of course, might even be declined. So even that in itself is a risk for farmers to engage with before getting the spades in the ground, yet alone when the reservoir is built, they're then also at the mercy of a licensing scheme where the Environment Agency is able to control when and if the reservoir is filled and then used. So we have lots of barriers in place to just putting more reservoirs on farm, but that is the key. Water security is so important, not only for households and for nature, but also for growing food. And we must push down those barriers so that we can get more of them on farm.
So how does the balance work then? At the moment, consumers need water, businesses need water. As you say, nature needs water. So if you give farmers more access, how does that work for everybody else?
Well, there's a touch of irony in here because legally water companies are obliged to provide water for households for our personal usage. We also have legislation in place that protects water for the environment. But there's a big missing part here, and that is there's no legislative framework around providing water for food. So that is left up to farmers to do, but of course we're all dependent on it because we all enjoy the food that's grown here in the UK. So what we must do is find a balance between the three, and that is possible. You know, sufficient rainwater does fall over these islands through the course of the year, which is sufficient for people's households, for nature and for farming. But of course it's making sure that it's available for use in each of those places. What I mean by that is holding water back in the winter as it falls and then using it appropriately in the summer. That is possible. We've just got to find the means to do so.
You're calling on the government to do something. What?
An average reservoir costs about £1 million. So I don't think it's too much to suggest that the government does have a role in enabling farmers to be able to do that, whether that be through a grant scheme or by introducing capital allowances, so making it a favourable tax environment for farmers to invest in things like water storage. And then, of course, also there's things like adapting our animal housing in order that can also be better managed for hot weather. So this is a significant issue for farmers, and all the scientists are telling us this is going to be one that's going to continue to grow.
Paul Tompkins. And that's it from us. I'm Charlotte Smith. The producer is Beatrice Fenton, and Farming Today is a BBC Audio Bristol production.